She built the biggest rehab center in the state and hid her addiction inside it. The call came in at 6:22 a.m. The dispatcher who took it would later say the voice on the other end was completely flat. Not panicked, not crying, just flat. The way people sound when their brain has not yet caught up to what their eyes are seeing. The woman said there was someone unresponsive in an office on the 3rd floor. She gave the address. She gave the suite number. Then she said one more thing before she hung up. Something the dispatcher noted in the incident log because it was unusual, because people in that state rarely say anything that precise. She said, "It's Dr. Ellison. It's Nora." The paramedics arrived at Clearwater Recovery Center on Morse Road in Columbus, Ohio, at 6:31 a.m. on March 4th, 2019. They entered through the main lobby, a wide, bright space with motivational quotes stenciled on the walls, and a large colour photograph mounted near the reception desk, a professional portrait of a woman in her early 50s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of smile that takes years to learn, the kind of smile that says, "You are safe here." They walked past that photograph with their equipment and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and turned left down a hall lined with closed office doors and found the last one on the right standing open. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Nora Ellison was seated in her chair behind her desk. Her reading glasses were still on. A yellow legal pad lay in front of her, covered in notes in blue pen. The last 2 lines trailed off mid-sentence, the letters growing uneven, then stopping. Her phone was on the desk beside the pad, screen still lit, showing a number she had tried to call. The call had never connected. The paramedics began working immediately, the way they are trained to without hesitation, but the body temperature and the colour of her skin and the particular stillness of her face told them what the TOC screen would confirm 4 days later. Heroin, laced with fentanyl. She was 54 years old. She had founded Clearwater Recovery Center 22 years earlier. She had personally overseen the treatment of more than 4,000 patients struggling with addiction. The facility she built was the largest licensed residential treatment center in the state of Ohio. 3 separate governors had shaken her hand. A public health journal had called her one of the most effective addiction treatment professionals in the American Midwest. A framed copy of that article hung on the wall of the very office where the paramedics were now working. The woman who spent her entire adult life pulling people back from the edge of this exact thing had gone over it herself, and not one person in that building had known it was happening. That is the part that requires sitting with for a moment. Not the tragedy of the death itself, though that is real, and it is enormous, but the specific, almost architectural impossibility of it. Clearwater Recovery was not some loosely run operation. It was a facility with licensed clinical staff, medication logs, incident reporting protocols, and regular state inspections. Nora had built those systems herself. She had trained the people who ran them. She had stood in front of rooms full of families and explained in careful and compassionate detail exactly how addiction hides, how it disguises itself as functionality, as competence, as control. She'd said those words hundreds of times. She had believed them. The staff began arriving for the morning shift around 6:45 a.m., most of them still in the parking lot when they saw the ambulance. By 7 o'clock there were 11 people standing in the lobby and nobody was speaking, and the photograph near the reception desk was visible from where every one of them stood. Patricia Lung, who had worked as Nora's assistant for 14 years and knew her schedule down to the 10-minute block, arrived at 7:03 and stopped just inside the front door. She looked at the elevator. She looked at the photograph. She'd noticed something once, about 8 months earlier. Something small, something she had told herself meant nothing. and standing in that lobby at 7:03 in the morning, she thought about that thing for the first time in months. She would not speak about it publicly for over a year. James Okafor was on the highway when his phone rang. He had been a patient at Clearwater in 2013, a 28-year-old Marine veteran with a combat-related opioid dependency that had stripped him down to almost nothing by the time he walked through those doors. Nora had been his primary counselor during the first 2 weeks of his treatment. He had been sober for 6 years. He now worked at the facility as a program coordinator. Nora had hired him herself, had argued for him in front of the board, had told the room that lived experience was not a liability in this work. It was the most valuable thing a staff member could bring. He pulled his car off the highway when the call came. He sat in a parking lot for 45 minutes. Then he drove to Clearwater because he did not know what else to do. The investigation that followed would take 7 months. The findings would surface details that reframed everything, not just about Nora Ellison's final years, but about the entire structure of the institution she built, the people inside it who saw things they did not report, the systems that were designed to catch exactly this and did not, and the question nobody could quite answer, not even the people who had known her longest. How does someone who can describe the neuroscience of addiction in plain language to a room full of frightened families, how does that person look in the mirror every morning and not see what everyone else eventually sees? Or did she see it? That is the question that does not go away. And the answer, when it finally comes, is not the one anyone expected. Nora Ellison grew up on Grafton Avenue in Dayton, Ohio, in a house with a cracked concrete driveway and a basketball hoop that listed 4 degrees to the left because her father had installed it himself on a Saturday afternoon and never gone back to fix it. The hoop stayed that way for 20 years. That detail, a thing slightly wrong that nobody corrected, would mean nothing until much later. Her father, Ron Ellison, coached football at Jefferson High School for 31 years. Her mother, Carol, worked rotating shifts at Miami Valley Hospital as an obstetric nurse, which meant that for large portions of Nora's childhood, dinner was whatever her father had managed to assemble by 6 o'clock, and the house ran on a kind of organised self-sufficiency that both children absorbed without being taught it. Nora was the younger of 2. Her brother Danny was 4 years older, broad-shouldered like their father, funny in the way that made teachers nervous, quick, a little sharp, the kind of funny that requires an audience to function. Danny was the one everybody noticed first. Nora was the one who paid attention to everything. She was not a prodigy. Her grades were good, not spectacular. She ran cross-country in high school, not because she was fast, but because she liked the specific quality of silence that came at mile 3, when the noise inside her head finally quieted and there was only the sound of her own breathing. She ran that way her whole life, not to win but to get somewhere quiet. She qualified for the state meet her junior year and finished 14th. She kept the ribbon. By the time Nora left for Ohio State in 1983, Danny was 22 and already drinking in a way that the family discussed privately but did not name. He had a good job at a sheet metal plant. He showed up. He was never, by any clinical definition, falling apart. Not yet. But there was a quality to his drinking that Ron Ellison later described, in a conversation with Nora years afterward, as drinking that had a purpose. Not celebration, not unwinding. Purpose. The kind that fills something specific. Nora noticed it at Christmas that first year home from college. She sat across from her brother at the dinner table and watched him reach for his 3rd beer before the food was served, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued most things, quietly, without comment, filing it somewhere she would return to later. She declared her psychology major that January. The connection was not dramatic. She did not storm into an advisor's office with a revelation. She simply knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has already made a decision and is only now finding the words for it, that she wanted to understand what she had seen across that dinner table, not fix it, understand it. The fixing came later, after she learned enough to know how rarely it actually worked. Ohio State in the mid-1980s had a psychology department that was rigorous without being warm, lots of behavioral theory, very little of what would now be called trauma-informed thinking. Nora absorbed it all and pushed further on her own, spending hours in the university library with journals and case studies that nobody had assigned. She was particularly drawn to the literature on compulsive behaviour, not because it was fashionable, because it wasn't, but because it was honest in a way that other areas of psychology were not yet ready to be. It said, plainly, that certain patterns of behaviour were not choices in any meaningful sense of the word. That the brain, under certain conditions, rewired itself in ways that overrode everything else. She graduated in 1987 and enrolled immediately in a dual master's program, social work and addiction counselling, at Ohio State's College of Social Work. The dual program was unusual. Most students picked one or the other. Nora wanted both because she had already grasped at 22 that addiction treatment failed most often, not because clinicians lacked knowledge, but because they lacked the practical tools to intervene in people's actual lives. Knowing what was wrong was the easy part. Getting someone housed, employed, connected, and surrounded by different people than the ones they used with, that required a completely different skill set. Danny's drinking had escalated by the time she started the master's program. He had lost the sheet metal job, found another one, lost that one too. He was not violent, not visibly broken, just increasingly unreliable in small ways that accumulated. A birthday missed. A phone call that went to voicemail and was never returned. The particular loneliness of loving someone who is slowly disappearing while standing right in front of you. Their mother Carol never used the word alcoholic. She said Danny was going through a rough patch, which was a thing she continued saying for 11 years. Nora finished the master's program in 1991. She took a position as a counsellor at a residential treatment facility in Columbus, a mid-sized operation on the east side, state-funded, chronically understaffed, with linoleum floors that had been waxed so many times they had turned a faint yellow. She worked there for 6 years. The caseloads were brutal, sometimes 40 active clients per counsellor, which made meaningful treatment almost theoretically impossible. She stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the clients themselves, not the institution. Those 6 years taught her things no degree had. She learned that people in recovery needed structure that was genuinely theirs, not imposed. She learned that the first 72 hours after someone stopped using were a medical event, not a moral one. She learned that the families of addicts suffered a particular kind of secondary trauma that almost nobody in the field was treating. She started running a family support group on Tuesday evenings, unpaid, in a borrowed conference room, with a handwritten sign taped to the door. Danny got sober in 1994. He was 33 years old. He did not do it through a treatment centre. He did it through Alcoholics Anonymous, which he attended for the first time because a co-worker drove him there and sat beside him in the parking lot until he agreed to go inside. That detail, someone physically present, not advising but simply there, was something Nora returned to repeatedly in later years when she talked about what actually changed people. His sobriety was not a straight line. He relapsed once in the spring of 1995 for about 6 weeks. Then he went back to AA. Then he stayed. By the time Nora founded Clearwater in 1997, Danny had 3 years of solid recovery, a new job managing inventory at a medical supply company, and a daughter named Meg who was 2 years old and did not yet know that her father had almost not made it to her. Nora founded Clearwater Recovery Centre in June of 1997 at age 32, with a $40,000 personal loan, a 6-month lease on the second floor of a commercial building on North High Street, and 3 staff members, a nurse, a counsellor, and an administrative assistant named Patricia Leung, who was 24 years old and had answered a classified ad in the Columbus Dispatch. The building shared a ground floor with a hardware store. Clients had to walk past displays of PVC pipe fittings and garden hoses to reach the staircase. Nora thought this was fine. She thought it was good, actually. Ordinary, unglamorous, continuous with the world people were trying to return to. The first 12 months were close to financial collapse 3 separate times. Nora paid herself last, always. There were weeks she did not pay herself at all. She drove a 1993 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it and ate lunch at her desk from a container she brought from home. Patricia, who would later describe those early years in interviews, said that Nora during that period had a quality she struggled to articulate. Not drive exactly, not ambition, but a kind of focused urgency, as though she was always working against a clock that other people couldn't hear. By 2001, Clearwater had a staff of 19 and had moved to a larger facility. By 2005, it had a waiting list of over 60 people, a number that Nora refused to accept as an operational reality. She viewed it as a failure, not of her but of the system. She began lobbying the state for expanded licensing, writing grant applications in the evenings after her clinical staff had gone home, arguing in letters to state health officials that the gap between need and capacity was not an abstraction. It was people dying in the time they spent waiting for a bed. She did not drink alcohol at staff gatherings. Not for any announced reason. She just didn't. Nobody thought much of it. She continued running, switching from cross-country distances to half marathons in her 40s, finishing the Columbus Half in 2007 with a time of 2 hours and 4 minutes, which she considered disappointing because she had trained for 1:58. She signed up for the next one immediately. She had never, as far as anyone who knew her was aware, used any substance beyond the occasional glass of wine at a conference dinner, which she would nurse for an hour and leave half finished. She had no history, no prior episodes, no red flags visible in any direction. That was what everyone believed. There was one thing, small and easily dismissed, that one person remembered only after everything had ended. Danny Ellison, in that eulogy that newspapers only partially quoted, mentioned that Nora had told him something once. Sometime in the early 2000s, he couldn't pin down the year, about how she'd always been afraid of what she called the feeling of relief, not the concept of it, the actual physical sensation, the way it moved through her body. She'd said she understood, on some level she didn't entirely trust, why a person would chase that feeling past every other thing they valued. Danny said he had thought she was talking about his recovery. He had thanked her for understanding. She had not corrected him. The knee had been a problem since 2008. A stress fracture originally. The kind that builds slowly in runners who add mileage faster than their body can absorb it. The kind that announces itself not as a sudden snap, but as a dull, deepening ache that gets filed under. I'll deal with it later, until later becomes a Thursday morning, when Nora stepped off a curb on her way into the Clearwater parking lot and felt something shift in a way that made her stop walking entirely and stand very still on the sidewalk for a full 30 seconds. Her briefcase in one hand, her coffee in the other, neither one touching the ground. She finished the workday. She drove herself to urgent care that evening. The X-ray showed a hairline fracture in the medial tibial plateau. Not catastrophic, but significant enough that the urgent care physician called an orthopedic colleague at Ohio State Medical Center the same night. She had surgery 3 days later. The orthopedic surgeon who performed the procedure was experienced, highly rated, and thorough. The surgery went cleanly. For post-operative pain, he prescribed oxycodone, 15 tablets, 5 milligrams each, to be taken as needed, no more than 1 every 6 hours. Standard protocol for that procedure. Exactly what he would have prescribed for anyone. Here is what oxycodone is, for anyone unfamiliar. It is an opioid painkiller, synthetic, derived from the same chemical family as heroin and morphine. It binds to specific receptors in the brain, opioid receptors, and does two things simultaneously. It blocks pain signals with remarkable efficiency, and it triggers a release of dopamine, the brain's primary pleasure and reward chemical, at a level that natural stimuli, food, exercise, human connection, cannot come close to matching. The brain notices this. The brain is extraordinarily good at noticing things that feel like that. Nora knew all of this, precisely and clinically and in considerable detail. She had explained opioid receptor binding to family groups at Clearwater dozens of times, always using the same plain language, always watching their faces shift from confusion to recognition, to a particular kind of grief when they understood that what had happened to their son, their daughter, their spouse, was not stubbornness or weakness, but chemistry. She took the first pill the night of the surgery in the recovery room, and felt the pain in her knee dissolve so completely it was as if the knee itself had been temporarily removed from her body. That was it. That was the whole moment. Nothing dramatic, no internal alarm, just the absence of pain, and then sleep. The deepest sleep she had managed in months. She took the pills exactly as prescribed for the first 11 days, one every 6 hours when needed. She tracked them on a notepad beside her bed, the time, the dose, because she was Nora Ellison and she tracked things. The notepad is a detail that matters later. On day 12, she took the last tablet and set the empty bottle on the bathroom shelf and went to work. By day 14, something had shifted in the architecture of her mornings. It was not pain. The knee was healing correctly. The follow-up X-ray showed good progress. It was something harder to name, a flatness, a particular texture of unease that arrived around 10 a.m. and sat behind her sternum like a dull pressure. She had experienced anxiety before, had managed it through running and work and the simple density of a demanding schedule. This was different. This was physical in a way anxiety was not, located not in the mind but in the body, in the specific place behind the ribs where, 3 weeks earlier, the oxycodone had put everything quiet. She recognized this. Of course she recognized it. She had sat across from people describing exactly this sensation for 20 years. The absence of the thing, the way the absence itself becomes the problem. She had a name for it, a clinical name, a physiological explanation, a treatment framework. She called the surgeon's office on day 15 and said her pain levels had increased. This was not entirely false. There was pain. The kind of pain that lives in the gap between what the nervous system has been trained to expect and what it is currently receiving. The surgeon's office, staffed by a nurse practitioner who had no reason to question the founder and director of the state's largest addiction treatment centre, called in a refill. 10 tablets this time. The prescription went to a Walgreens on Morse Road, 4 blocks from Clearwater. She picked it up on her lunch break. She took one in the car before driving back. The second prescription lasted 8 days. The flatness returned on day 9. She called a different number this time. Not the surgeon's office, but an urgent care clinic in Westerville, about 12 miles from her home, telling them she was a post-surgical patient with ongoing discomfort and that her primary physician was unavailable. The urgent care doctor prescribed 10 tablets of hydrocodone, slightly different molecule, essentially the same effect, and she filled that prescription at a CVS in Westerville she had never visited before. She did not return to that urgent care clinic for a second visit. Instead, she found a third clinic in Hilliard, on the west side of Columbus, and a fourth in Gahanna to the northeast. She rotated. 4 clinics, 4 pharmacies, each visit weeks apart, each complaint slightly varied. Post-surgical pain, a prior injury, a flare-up from an old running problem. The doctors she saw were rotating urgent care staff. Not the same physician twice, no continuity of records, no flag raised. This is something worth understanding about that era. Ohio's Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, the statewide database that tracks controlled substance prescriptions, existed in 2011, but participation by prescribers was not yet mandatory. It would not become mandatory until 2015, which meant that in 2011, the system designed to catch exactly this pattern was a system that nobody was required to check. Nora knew this. She had testified before a state health committee in 2009 about the gaps in Ohio's monitoring program, had submitted written recommendations arguing for mandatory participation. The committee had thanked her for her testimony. Nothing had changed yet. She was not thinking about that testimony when she drove to the clinic in Gahanna. She was thinking about getting there before they closed at 7. Somewhere inside this 4-month window, a line moved. Not a dramatic line, not a conscious crossing. The original purpose, managing surgical pain, had ended. The visits to the clinics were no longer about the knee. The knee was fine. What was no longer fine was the hour between waking up and taking the first dose of the day, which had grown from something manageable into something that reorganized her entire morning around its resolution. This is what addiction researchers mean when they use the word dependence. Not a character trait, not a failure of willpower. A specific neurological state in which the brain has recalibrated its baseline around the presence of the substance, so that the absence of it registers not as neutral, but as actively wrong, as emergency, as something that must be corrected before anything else can happen. Nora had explained this to family groups so many times she could have delivered it in her sleep. She was living inside it and calling it pain management. By the end of 2011, the clinic rotation was becoming harder to sustain. 2 of the 4 urgent care locations had new front desk software that cross-referenced recent visit dates, and one physician had noted her presentation with enough specificity that a second visit to the same clinic would carry real risk. She knew this because she understood how clinical documentation worked. The same knowledge that helped her identify warning signs in her clients was now functioning as a roadmap for avoidance. In November 2011, a patient was discharged from Clearwater after completing a 90-day residential program. His name was not recorded in any public document related to Nora's case, only referenced obliquely in the post-death investigation. What the investigation noted was that this individual, prior to his Clearwater admission, had been obtaining prescription opioids through an informal network of contacts. Not a street dealer in the conventional sense, but someone who sourced pills from people who sold their legitimate prescriptions. The discharged patient did not intend to reconnect with that network. He had, by all clinical measures, completed treatment successfully. But he knew people. And before he left, in a conversation Nora initiated under the guise of discussing his aftercare resources, she asked, carefully, obliquely, in the language of someone making a clinical inquiry, about how people in his situation had previously obtained medication between prescription gaps. He told her, because she was Dr. Ellison, because you told Dr. Ellison things. She had a name and a number by the end of that week. What happened next did not happen immediately. There was a gap, 3 weeks, maybe 4, where she did not use that number. She managed on a reduced dose, stretching her remaining supply, telling herself she would handle this through legitimate channels, that she would find a pain management specialist and be honest, that she was still in control of what happened next. Then she ran out entirely. She made the call on a Sunday afternoon in December, parked in the lot of a grocery store on Bethel Road, the engine running, the heater on. She ordered enough to last her 2 weeks. She paid in cash when they met in the same parking lot 40 minutes later. She drove home. She did not tell anyone. There was no one in her entire life who had any idea this was happening. That is the part that doesn't resolve easily. Not the obtaining of the drugs, not the lies to the clinic physicians, but the aloneness of it. The complete unbroken privacy of a secret that lived inside someone who spent every working day helping other people crack theirs open. How long had she been carrying something she wouldn't name? A day in Nora Ellison's life in 2012 looked, from the outside, like the day of a highly functioning executive in a demanding field. She arrived at Clearwater between 7:15 and 7:30, always first among the leadership staff, always with a container of coffee she'd made at home. She reviewed the overnight incident logs before her coat was off. Any patient crisis during the night hours, any medical event, any staff decision that needed a clinical review. She held a standing Monday morning meeting at 8:30 that her department heads described, in later interviews, as the most efficiently run hour of their professional week. She returned calls during the 12-minute window between morning rounds and the first scheduled appointment. She ate lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5. From the outside, nothing had changed. The inside was structured entirely differently now. The first thing Nora did each morning before the coffee, before the overnight logs, was take a pill. She kept them in a contact lens case, the small 2-chambered plastic kind, blue cap on one side, clear on the other, tucked into the inner zip pocket of her work bag. The blue side held 2 tablets. She restocked it every evening before leaving the office so that the morning dose was always ready, always there, always exactly where she needed it to be without having to think about it. The thinking was the part she could not afford. The thinking, in those early morning minutes before the pill took effect, was the part that went somewhere she could not allow herself to go while sitting in traffic on Morse Road. She took the pill in her car in the parking garage before she walked into the building. Always in the garage, never at her desk. This distinction, the careful maintenance of physical boundaries around the behaviour, was not accidental. It was the same compartmentalization that allowed her to sit across from patients in intake sessions and conduct thorough, accurate, clinically sound assessments without any internal dissonance she could not manage. She had built a wall between the person at the desk and the person in the parking garage. What opioids do to the brain over sustained use is not complicated to understand, though it is genuinely difficult to fully grasp from the outside. Here is the basic mechanism. The brain has natural opioid receptors, built-in sites that respond to the body's own pain relief chemicals like endorphins. When an external opioid arrives, oxycodone, hydrocodone, heroin, fentanyl, any of them, it floods those receptors with a signal far stronger than anything the body produces naturally. Dopamine surges, pain recedes. A state of profound physiological calm arrives, one that is not sleep and not ordinary wakefulness, but something in between, something that the brain's reward system immediately begins cataloguing as the most important thing it has ever experienced. The problem is adaptation. The brain, exposed to this signal repeatedly, begins to assume it as the new normal. It downregulates its own natural opioid production, produces less of its own chemicals because the external supply has made that redundant. The receptors become less sensitive, requiring more of the substance to produce the same effect. This is tolerance, and tolerance is not a choice or a character trait any more than requiring glasses after years of eye strain is a character trait. Nora understood this at a cellular level. She could diagram the receptor sites. She had done so on a whiteboard in a Clearwater family session with a blue marker for a woman named Sandra whose son had been through 3 treatment attempts. She had stood at that whiteboard and said, clearly and without qualification, that this was not her son making a decision. This was her son's brain doing exactly what brains do under these conditions. Sandra had wept with something that looked like relief. Nora had capped the marker and moved on to the next point in the session. The supply through the informal network lasted most of 2012. The contact, who the investigation would later describe only as a male individual in his mid-30s with no prior criminal record, sourcing pills from multiple legitimate prescription holders who sold their monthly supplies for cash, was reliable, punctual, and completely unknown to anyone in Nora's professional world. They met in parking lots, sometimes the same one, sometimes different ones. He drove a grey pickup truck. She paid in cash she withdrew from a personal savings account, never more than $200 at a time, never at the same ATM twice in the same week. She was, in the language of her own clinical training, a high-functioning addict. The term sounds almost complimentary. It is not. What it actually describes is someone whose external performance has not yet visibly degraded, whose job, relationships, and daily routines still appear intact to outside observers, while the internal architecture of their life is being quietly reorganized around one central requirement. Everything else becomes secondary logistics. Now, James Okafor. In March of 2013, a man walked into Clearwater's intake office who had been referred by a Veterans Affairs counsellor in Columbus. He was 28 years old, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marine Corps, and had been prescribed opioid painkillers following a combat-related back injury in 2010. By the time he sat down in the intake chair, he had been using for 3 years, had attempted to stop twice on his own, and had lost a relationship, a job at an auto parts warehouse, and approximately 40 pounds from his heaviest adult weight. He wore the same jacket to every intake appointment, a dark green canvas field jacket, Marine's insignia on the left chest, and he filled out the intake paperwork with a mechanical pencil he brought himself. His name was James Okafor. His parents had emigrated from Nigeria to Cleveland in 1981. He was the youngest of 3 sons. He was, by the assessment of the intake counsellor who processed his paperwork, among the most self-aware patients they had ever seen at initial intake. Someone who understood exactly what had happened to him and had not yet translated that understanding into the ability to stop it. This is a specific and heartbreaking category of person in addiction treatment. Full cognitive clarity, 0 traction. Nora was not assigned to James's case. She was the director. She hadn't carried a clinical caseload in 4 years. But Clearwater had a practice she had instituted herself in the early years and refused to abandon. The director sat in on 2 intake sessions per week, rotating randomly, as a quality assurance measure and as a way of keeping herself connected to what the facility actually did. She happened to sit in on James's second session on a Tuesday in late March, and something in his file caught her attention. She asked the assigned counsellor afterward if she could review his case notes. She began checking in on his progress informally every week or 2, not managing his treatment, just present. The way Danny's co-worker had once sat in a parking lot until Danny agreed to go inside. James completed the 90-day residential program in June of 2013. He attended every group session. He never missed a one-on-one. He was by his discharge date 3 months sober and in possession of a plan, an actual, written step-by-step plan for what the next 6 months of his life would look like, including a part-time job at a sporting goods store and twice-weekly outpatient group sessions. Nora attended his discharge meeting, which was unusual for a director, and nobody said anything about it because she was Nora and she did things like that. He was back at Clearwater 3 months later, not as a patient but as a volunteer. He ran a peer support group on Thursday evenings, recovering veterans primarily, though the group was open to anyone. He was 28 years old and had 4 months of sobriety and stood at the front of that room with a calm, unhurried authority that the licensed counsellors on staff found slightly startling. Nora was the one who had suggested he apply to volunteer. She had told him, in a meeting that Patricia Lung scheduled as a routine check-in, that the quality she had noticed in him, that specific combination of self-knowledge and patience with other people's pace, was rare enough that it was wasteful not to use it. He had started the volunteer position within 2 weeks. What James did not know, sitting in that Thursday evening group in the fall of 2013, was that the woman who had believed in him enough to put him in that room was, on certain Tuesdays and Thursdays, meeting a grey pickup truck in the parking lot of a strip mall on Livingston Avenue to buy the pills that made the next week's work feel possible. The parallel was not visible, it never is, from inside one of the 2 parallel lines. By 2013, Nora's daily dose had roughly doubled from where it had started. This is not unusual. It is the predictable consequence of tolerance, the brain demanding more to produce the same baseline. She had not yet experienced what she privately noted in a journal she kept locked in her car's glove compartment, the only place she wrote honestly about what was happening, as a full loss of control. She still believed, in 2013, that she could manage the trajectory. She still believed that the wall between the parking garage and the desk was solid. The journal itself was discovered after her death. It contained 3 years of entries, irregular, sometimes weeks apart. The investigators who reviewed it noted that the entries were written in the same spare, clinical language Nora used in her professional documentation. Almost no emotional register, just observations, dates, quantities, a few terse self-assessments. One entry from October 2013 read only, "Dose stable. James's group going well. Need to sort the supply situation before December. 3 things in 2 sentences, only one of them about herself." The supply situation she referenced in that entry was this. Her contact with the grey pickup truck had mentioned, the week before, that he was moving to Cincinnati and would not be able to continue the arrangement. She had 6 weeks, maybe 8, to find another source or reduce her dose enough to manage without one. She did not reduce the dose. What she found instead was something that closed one problem and opened another that was categorically different. A shift so significant that the Nora Ellison of 2012 would not have recognized the Nora Ellison who made it. But in the fall of 2013, from the outside, all anyone could see was a woman doing extraordinary work. James Okafor's Thursday group had a waiting list by November. Nora read the list and approved the addition of a second session on Monday evenings. She wrote the approval memo herself by hand on a Tuesday morning, after the parking garage, before the overnight logs. The wall was still standing, for now. The new source arrived through a different discharged patient, in a different way, and what it provided was not pills. This matters, because pills, oxycodone, hydrocodone, the pressed tablets with pharmaceutical markings and consistent dosages, exist within a certain psychological framework. They look like medicine. They arrive in bottles or in hand-counted plastic bags, but they carry the residual legitimacy of a prescription, of a doctor, of a system. A person can maintain, for a surprisingly long time, an internal narrative in which pills are management rather than addiction, treatment rather than dependence. Heroin does not allow that narrative. There is no version of the story in which heroin is medicine. But Nora didn't get to heroin yet, not in late 2013. What the new contact provided was OxyContin, the extended release form of oxycodone, 40 mg tablets, significantly stronger than what she'd been taking, sold in quantities large enough that her supply anxiety, the constant background hum of what happens when this runs out, quieted for the first time in 2 years. The quiet was its own kind of dangerous. Ohio's prescription drug monitoring program became mandatory for prescribers in March 2015. This was a significant change. Doctors and pharmacists were now legally required to check the database before issuing or filling controlled substance prescriptions. The database cross-referenced patient names, dates of birth, and prescription histories across every licensed pharmacy in the state. It was exactly the kind of systemic tool that Nora had publicly advocated for. She had in fact submitted a letter of support to the state health department during the legislative comment period, 3 months before the mandate took effect. The mandate did not affect her directly anymore. She had not filled a legitimate prescription since 2012, but it tightened the supply chain she depended on. The people who sourced pills by selling their own legitimate prescriptions, the informal network her contacts moved through, found themselves increasingly visible to the monitoring system. 2 of the 3 people the investigation later identified as having supplied Nora, directly or indirectly, between 2013 and 2015, stopped their activity entirely when the mandate took effect, spooked by conversations with others in the network about enforcement risk. By mid-2015, Nora's supply had become unpredictable in a way it had never been before. This is the part that addiction medicine researchers point to when they discuss why prescription opioid crackdowns, implemented without parallel expansion of treatment access, frequently produce an unintended consequence. People who are dependent on prescription opioids, suddenly cut off from their supply, move to heroin. It is cheaper, it is more available, and in a body already dependent on opioids, it produces the same biological effect. The transition is, from a purely neurochemical standpoint, almost seamless. From every other standpoint, it is a cliff. Nora had counseled people through exactly this transition. She had sat with patients who described it, the practicality of it, the way it happened almost without a decision point, one thing running out and another thing being available, the brain caring nothing for the category, only for the molecule. She had documented those transitions in patient files with a notation shift from prescription opioid use to illicit opioid use, and had flagged them for intensified treatment planning. She made the transition herself sometime in the late spring of 2015. The first crack visible to the outside world appeared on a Monday morning in September of that year. Patricia Leung arrived at Clearwater at 7 a.m., as she always did, to prepare the agenda for the 8:30 leadership meeting. Nora's assistant for 18 years by that point, she knew Nora's schedule with a granularity that bordered on clinical. She knew which board members made Nora's jaw tighten, which grant deadlines produced a particular quality of silence on Friday afternoons, which coffee mug Nora used when she was in a focused mood versus a restless one. Patricia had built her professional life around the precise reading of one person's operational state. Nora arrived at 7:49, 19 minutes later than her earliest ever arrival, 44 minutes later than the Monday morning standard she had maintained for 18 years. She said nothing about it. She took off her coat, sat down, and began reviewing documents. Her movements were slightly, not dramatically, not obviously, just slightly, slower than usual, as if each action required a fraction of a second more intention than normal. Patricia noted it the way she noted everything. Without comment, filed. The 8:30 meeting ran smoothly. Nora was sharp, precise, and fully present in the way that mattered. She caught an error in a budget projection that 2 department heads had missed, and she asked a clinical question about a patient cohort that reframed the entire discussion. Nothing was visibly wrong. If anything, the meeting was better than average. Patricia still thought about those 19 minutes on the drive home that evening. She didn't say anything. This is the part that requires understanding from the inside, not the outside. Patricia Leung had worked for Nora Ellison for nearly 2 decades. The professional relationship had a gravity to it that operated differently from a standard employer-employee dynamic. Nora was not just her boss. She was, in a real and documented sense, the person Patricia had organised her working life around. Questioning Nora felt structurally impossible in the same way that questioning the building's foundation feels impossible while you're standing in it. And besides, it was 19 minutes. Once. James Okafor had been promoted to program coordinator in January 2015, a paid position, full-time, with benefits, that Nora had created specifically for him by consolidating 2 part-time administrative roles. He ran the peer support program, supervised volunteer staff, and served as the primary liaison between Clearwater's clinical team and the VA referral network that now sent a steady stream of veterans to the facility. He was, by any operational measure, exceptionally good at the job. His sobriety date was June 14th, 2013. He marked it every year by driving to the lake in Hoover Reservoir and sitting on the same bench for an hour, alone. In October 2015, James was walking from the program coordinator's office to the supply room to retrieve folders for a group session when he passed Nora's office. The door was partially open. He glanced in, not deliberately, the way anyone glances through an open door while walking past, and registered something that he would later struggle to articulate precisely. Not what she was doing. She was sitting at her desk looking at documents, entirely ordinary. It was something about her eyes, a particular quality of gloss, a slight heaviness in the upper lids that did not belong on the face of a woman who, by the schedule on Patricia's whiteboard, had nothing more exhausting that morning than 2 administrative calls and a grant review. He kept walking. He told himself he'd imagined it. The folder retrieval took 3 minutes. By the time he was back in the program room setting up chairs, he had half convinced himself the light in her office had simply been odd, the angle from the hallway misleading. He had not imagined it. He would know this later, with the complete and useless certainty of retrospect. The monitoring program's ripple effect on supply chains was not the only pressure Nora was managing in 2015. The facility itself was in the middle of its most significant expansion since its founding. A capital campaign to fund a new 60-bed residential wing, requiring a state grant application of considerable complexity, multiple board presentations, and a construction management process that Patricia described as the most logistically demanding thing Clearwater had ever attempted. Nora was the engine of all of it. The grant application alone ran to 212 pages, the majority of which she wrote or substantially revised herself. The application was submitted in November 2015. The state approved it in February 2016 in the amount of $4.3 million. The approval letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Patricia printed it and brought it to Nora's office. Nora read it once, set it flat on her desk, and sat very still for a moment. Patricia, who had expected some version of the contained but genuine satisfaction she had seen Nora display at previous professional milestones, noticed instead that Nora looked, this was the word Patricia used a year later to investigators, tired, not relieved, not pleased, just tired, in a way that didn't match the size of what they had just accomplished. Patricia brought her a second coffee and closed the door on the way out. There was something else happening inside Clearwater's walls that winter, something small enough to dismiss and large enough in retrospect to stop the breath. The facility's medication management system operated under strict protocols. Controlled substances like methadone, buprenorphine and naltrexone, all used in medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction, were stored in a locked pharmaceutical cabinet in the clinical wing, access restricted to licensed nursing staff, every dispensation logged in triplicate. The logs were reviewed monthly by the clinical director, then countersigned by Nora as part of her executive oversight function. In December 2015, a night shift nurse named Rosa Tanner noticed a discrepancy between the physical count of methadone tablets in the cabinet and the number reflected in the dispensation log. The difference was small, 7 tablets over a 2-week period, small enough to be a logging error. She flagged it to her supervisor, who flagged it to the clinical director, who drafted a brief incident report and routed it through the standard channel. The standard channel ended at Nora's desk. The report sat in her inbox for 11 days. Then it was marked resolved. Her initials in the resolution field, dated January 4th, 2016, with a notation that the discrepancy had been reviewed and attributed to a transcription error in the night log. No audit was conducted. No external review was requested. No follow-up was scheduled. Rosa Tanner, when interviewed after Nora's death, said that she had assumed the resolution was legitimate because the resolution came from Nora. Because it was Nora. 7 tablets of methadone, 11 days, 2 initials in a box. The question that nobody asked then, and that everyone would ask later, too late, was whether the discrepancy had been a transcription error at all, and whether this was the first time it had happened, or simply the first time anyone had noticed. The new 60-bed wing opened on September 12, 2017. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew the Governor's Chief of Staff, 2 state senators, the Columbus City Health Commissioner, and a local news crew that arrived 40 minutes early and filmed the parking lot while they waited. Patricia had arranged white folding chairs in 3 rows on the lawn outside the new entrance. There were exactly enough chairs for everyone invited, a podium with a microphone, a ribbon of blue satin stretched across the double doors, the same shade of blue as Clearwater's logo. Nora stood at the podium in a dark blazer and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. The new segment aired that evening on the 6 o'clock broadcast. The anchor introduced it as a story about hope. Nora appeared on screen for 42 seconds, composed and precise, talking about the gap between need and capacity, the same argument she'd been making to anyone who had listened for 2 decades. She looked, to anyone watching, like someone entirely in command of everything around her. She had used that morning, in the parking garage, before the coat came off. The wing itself was genuinely significant. 60 additional residential beds in a state where the opioid crisis had been accelerating without pause for 5 years. Ohio had recorded 4,293 overdose deaths in 2016, a number that represented a 40% increase from 3 years prior. Franklin County, where Clearwater operated, was among the hardest hit. The waiting list for residential treatment statewide ran into the thousands. What Nora had built, the physical structure of it, the funded beds, the licensed staff, it was real. It worked. The people who cycled through those beds and came out the other side were real too, with names and children and jobs and second chances that would not have existed without this place. Both things were true simultaneously. The building worked. The woman who built it was disappearing inside herself. By 2016, Nora's use of heroin had settled into a daily pattern that her tolerance had flattened into something resembling functional stability. Not high, not sick, just maintained at a level the brain had recalibrated around as baseline. This is what the outside world sees when it sees a high-functioning addict at the middle stage, someone who appears slightly muted, slightly slower, someone who might be tired or stressed or simply getting older. Nothing that doesn't have a dozen plausible explanations in the life of a 51-year-old running a major healthcare facility under chronic systemic pressure. The contact she'd found after the prescription supply dried up operated differently from anyone she had dealt with before. He was not a dealer in the street corner sense. He was a man in his late 30s. The investigation would identify him only as a secondary source in a distribution chain originating outside Columbus, who she reached through a phone number passed through a sequence of people she'd encountered at the margins of her professional world. a family member of a former patient, a person at a community meeting, a chain of 3 handoffs that took 6 months to navigate. He was careful. She was careful. They met infrequently, transactions lasting under 4 minutes. She used cash from a personal money market account she'd opened at a credit union in Worthington, in her own name but with a mailing address that was a UPS store box she rented for $42 a month. The investigation traced this account after her death. It had been opened in October 2014 and showed withdrawals totaling just over $68,000 over the following 4.5 years. Small amounts, always under $500, always in cash, never patterned enough to trigger automated bank reporting thresholds. $68,000 over 4.5 years. The arithmetic of it tells its own story. Meanwhile, Clearwater was producing some of the most significant outcomes data in the facility's history. The 2017 annual report, which Nora personally compiled and designed, showed a 63% completion rate for the 90-day residential program, 11 points above the national average for similar facilities. The report was distributed to state health officials, board members, and donors. James Okafor's peer support program was cited specifically, with outcome data showing that patients who participated in peer support, alongside clinical treatment, completed the residential program at a rate 22% higher than those who received clinical treatment alone. James read that citation in the annual report sitting at his desk on a November morning, and felt, with a clarity he described later as almost physical, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was 32 years old, 4 years sober, and growing into his role with a steadiness that the clinical staff had begun to notice and reference openly. He had completed a bachelor's degree in social work through an online program while working full-time. 3 years of coursework done mostly in the evenings after the Monday and Thursday peer groups, the textbooks stacked on the passenger seat of his car because his apartment was too small to have a dedicated desk. He had applied to Ohio State's master's program in social work and been accepted for the following fall semester. Nora had written his recommendation letter, 2 pages, single-spaced, specific in a way that recommendation letters rarely are. Particular observations from particular moments, details about his clinical thinking and his capacity to hold complexity without collapsing it. He had read it once, the copy she gave him, and then folded it and put it in the inner pocket of the green field jacket which he still wore, which still fit. He had no idea what was happening 40 feet down the hall. Patricia Lung had an idea, not the full shape of it, not the specifics, but something had accumulated in her peripheral vision over the course of 2016 and into 2017 that she had not been able to organise into a coherent picture and therefore had not acted on. Small things. A water bottle that smelled faintly of something that wasn't water, left on Nora's desk one evening after a long board meeting. A cancelled appointment with the facility's own medical director, the second cancellation in a row, attributed to a scheduling conflict that Patricia herself managed and knew had not existed. A moment in the elevator, just the two of them, when Nora stood very still and breathed through something that lasted about 8 seconds and then passed, and Nora straightened and said nothing, and Patricia said nothing, and the elevator doors opened and they both stepped out. Patricia had worked in addiction treatment long enough to know what she was looking at. That was the problem. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and the knowing made it worse, not better, because the person she was looking at was Nora. She filed the second incident report in June 2017. The medication discrepancy this time was more significant. 14 tablets of methadone and a partial blister pack of buprenorphine, a different medication used in opioid treatment, also a controlled substance, missing from the pharmaceutical cabinet over a 3-week period. Rosa Tanner, the same night shift nurse who had flagged the first discrepancy 18 months earlier, had kept her own informal count since then, a small notebook she carried in her scrubs pocket with hash marks next to dates. The notebook showed 4 separate occasions where the physical count did not match the log. Rosa brought the notebook to Patricia directly this time, bypassing the standard chain of command. She said, in that meeting, that she had not gone through the usual channel the first time either, or rather she had, and the usual channel had gone to Nora's desk, and after that nothing had happened, and she had not known what to do with that, and so she had started the notebook. Patricia looked at the notebook. She looked at the dates. She drafted a formal incident report and routed it to the board's compliance subcommittee, bypassing Nora's inbox entirely. The first time in 18 years she had routed anything over Nora's head. The compliance subcommittee consisted of 3 board members, 2 of whom had been appointed by Nora herself. They reviewed the report. They requested a written response from facility leadership. The written response they received, a memo, 2 paragraphs, citing an inventory management software migration as the likely source of the logging errors and noting that a manual audit would be scheduled, was written on Clearwater letterhead and signed by Nora Ellison. The manual audit was never scheduled. The board accepted the memo. Both discrepancy reports were filed in the compliance folder. The compliance folder was reviewed annually. The next annual review was 8 months away. Here is what was happening inside that pharmaceutical cabinet, as best as investigators could reconstruct it. Methadone, in addiction treatment, functions differently from how most people imagine. It is itself an opioid, a long-acting one, prescribed in controlled daily doses to prevent withdrawal in people dependent on heroin or other opioids, allowing them to stabilize their lives without the cycle of sickness and craving that untreated dependence produces. It does not produce a high at maintenance doses in a person with established tolerance. What it does, in a person whose tolerance has built to the level Nora's had by 2016, is prevent withdrawal. It keeps the floor from falling out. She was not taking it to get high. She was taking it because her supply had become unreliable enough that there were gaps, days when the contact was unavailable, when a transaction fell through, when the logistics of maintaining secrecy left her without what her body now required simply to function. The methadone from the cabinet filled those gaps, enough to get through a Tuesday, enough to sit at the podium on September 12th and speak for 11 minutes without notes. The TEDx talk came in October 2017, 1 month after the ribbon cutting. A regional TEDx organizer had reached out in the spring following a profile in Columbus Monthly that had described Nora as one of the city's most influential figures in public health. The talk was filmed at a theatre in the Short North neighbourhood on a Saturday afternoon, in front of an audience of approximately 400 people. Nora's topic was the failure of stigma as a public health strategy. The argument, supported by 15 years of Clearwater outcome data, that treating addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical condition produced worse outcomes at every measurable level. The talk ran 16 minutes and 40 seconds. It was sharp, evidenced, and delivered with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been making this argument longer than most of the audience had been paying attention to the issue. It received a standing ovation. The video was posted online and accumulated 40,000 views in its first month, shared widely in public health and addiction medicine circles. In the front row, James Okafor sat next to Patricia Leung. Both of them had been there since before the doors opened. James watched Nora on that stage and felt something he later described as a complicated pride. Pride in her, pride in what the work had built, and beneath it, a question he'd been sitting with for 2 years but had never quite brought into focus. The question was this: why did Nora, at staff events, at the ribbon cutting, at every gathering where her presence produced a visible energy in the people around her, Why did she always look, to him, like she was working at something? Not performing exactly. Working. Like a runner at mile 3 who has found their pace but is monitoring every breath. He filed this observation in the same place he had filed the thing about her eyes in 2015. Somewhere he didn't look at directly. Then, in the spring of 2018, James found something he could not file away. He was in Nora's office on a Tuesday afternoon in April, using her desk to review a stack of program files while she was out at a state health department meeting. She'd given him standing permission to use the space when she was away, because the program coordinator's office was too small to spread documents. He was not looking through her things. He was looking at a file from 2015 that contained outcome data he needed for a grant report, and it was the last file in a stack, and when he moved it, he revealed a corner of paper beneath that had been partially under the desk blotter. It was a page torn from a legal pad, in Nora's handwriting, a column of numbers, dates on the left, quantities on the right, spanning what appeared to be several months. The numbers on the right range from small integers to 2-digit figures. There were no labels, no headings, no context. He looked at it for a long time. Then he placed it back exactly where he had found it, under the blotter, at the same angle. He sat with that page for 3 weeks before he did anything. He ran it against every possible benign interpretation, medication tracking for a patient, a personal health log, financial notes in some format he wasn't recognizing. Each interpretation collapsed under the weight of the specific numbers, the specific intervals, the specific way someone writes something they do not want to be found and yet cannot bring themselves to destroy. He knew what he was looking at. He had sat across from enough people in recovery, had listened to enough histories, had read enough intake documentation to recognize a use log when he saw one. He went to Nora directly. What happened in that meeting would not become fully clear until much later, because James did not record it, and Nora left no account of it, and the only version of events came from James himself, 18 months after her death, at a conference in Cincinnati where he spoke publicly for the first time about what he knew and when he knew it. What he said was this. She looked at him across her desk with complete steadiness, and she told him that he was right, that she had struggled, that she'd been through a very hard period, and that she'd been clean for 8 months. She said it the way she said everything, with the particular calm of someone who had delivered difficult news to frightened people for 20 years and knew exactly how to hold a room. She said she had it handled. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he believed her. Because it was Nora. Because you believed Nora. He drove home that evening and felt for the first time in months that the thing he had been circling had resolved. He did not follow up. He didn't request documentation. He didn't loop in Patricia or the board or any external body. He accepted what she told him with the same weight he would have given a clinical assessment from the most respected professional he had ever known. She was not clean. She had not been clean. The 8 months was a number she had chosen because it was long enough to be credible and recent enough to be current. But here is what James did not know, what nobody knew, what would not surface until the investigation pulled records from 2 treatment facilities in different states, accessed under a court order 7 months after her death. Nora had tried to get clean, twice, in secret, under a name that was not her name. The name she used was Catherine Norris. Not a dramatic reinvention, just a first name close enough to her own that she would answer to it without hesitation, and a last name chosen, as far as anyone could determine, for no particular reason. She paid in cash. She provided a Kentucky driver's license that the investigation was never able to fully account for, either a convincing forgery or obtained through a channel that left no traceable record. She listed her occupation as a school administrator. She gave a home address in Lexington that corresponded to a real street, a real block, a real row of houses, none of which contained anyone named Catherine Norris. The first admission was in August 2016 at a residential treatment facility in Indianapolis called Meridian House. 42 beds, privately operated, with a clinical model built around medication-assisted treatment combined with cognitive behavioral therapy. The same evidence-based approach Clearwater used, the same framework Nora had helped design and refine over 2 decades. She would have known, walking through those doors, exactly what was coming. Every intake question, every assessment tool, every group session format. She had written versions of all of it herself. She stayed for 19 days. Meridian House's standard residential program ran 28 days. She left 9 days early, signing herself out against clinical advice, which was her legal right as a voluntary admission. The discharge notes, obtained by investigators under court order and summarized in the final report without full reproduction, indicated that she had been compliant with the program, engaged in sessions, and showed measurable progress on standardized assessment tools. The clinical staff had been surprised by her early departure. One notation in the file described her as among the most self-directed patients they had encountered. Someone who arrived already knowing the language and the mechanisms, who asked questions that clinicians usually asked each other rather than their patients. She drove back to Columbus. She was using again within 11 days. 11 days, after 19 days of residential treatment. The speed of relapse after a sustained period of high-dose opioid use is not a failure of the treatment or of the person. It is a function of what opioids do to the brain's reward circuitry over years of dependence. The neural pathways do not reset in 19 days, or 28, or sometimes in any fixed period at all. The craving does not wait politely while the clinical work catches up. It is simply there, enormous and biological. The moment the controlled environment ends and the original world resumes. Nora knew this. She had explained it to families in exactly those terms. She knew it, and she drove back to Columbus anyway, because knowing and stopping are not the same thing, and she had known that too in the abstract for her entire career. The abstract had just become her life. The second attempt came in March 2017, 6 months later. This time she chose a facility in Pittsburgh, Allegheny Recovery Associates, a 60-bed residential center with a strong reputation in medication-assisted treatment. She was admitted as Catherine Norris again. Same false license, same Kentucky address, same occupation. She stayed for 24 days this time, 4 days longer than the first attempt, 4 days short of the standard program completion. She left on a Thursday. The following Monday she was at the Clearwater ribbon-cutting planning meeting, sitting at the head of the conference table, moving through a 14-item agenda with her usual precision. Patricia had prepared a revised timeline for the construction contractor. Nora reviewed it, made 3 changes in the margins, and handed it back. The meeting ran 40 minutes. Nobody in that room had any idea she'd been in Pittsburgh the previous Thursday. Here is what the twist in this story actually is, because it is not the false name, not the secret admissions, not even the failed attempts. Those are facts, and they are stunning, but they are not the reframe. The reframe is this. Every assumption built up over the previous 7 years of this story rests on the premise that Nora Ellison was, in some fundamental way, in denial. That the woman who ran an addiction treatment center while secretly addicted was operating under the classic self-deception that addiction produces, the internal narrative that says, I am the exception, I am in control, this is different for me. She was not in denial. She knew. She had always known. She used the clinical language in her private journal not because she was disconnected from reality, but because she was in complete contact with it. so complete that she documented her own disease the way she would have documented a patient's, with dates and quantities and terse self-assessments, because she had no other language for what was happening and no other way to hold it that felt like honesty. She had walked into 2 treatment facilities under a false name, not because she didn't understand what she needed, but because she understood it completely and could not risk the truth. Because the truth that the founder and director of Ohio's largest addiction treatment center was a heroin addict would have ended Clearwater. Not immediately perhaps, not legally, but operationally, reputationally, in the trust of every patient in every bed, in the confidence of every donor and state official whose support kept the lights on and the 60 new beds filled. She had made a calculation, her recovery against the institution, and she had twice tried to find a way to achieve the first without destroying the second. She had failed, and she'd kept going anyway. This changes the shape of everything that came before it. The lie she told James in that office, "I've been clean for 8 months," was not the lie of someone who had fooled themselves. It was the lie of someone who had thought about this more carefully than James could have known, who had looked at the situation from every angle available to her, and who had concluded that protecting him from the full weight of it was the only thing she could offer in that moment. The journal entry from the week after that meeting with James, one of the last full entries in the document, contained a list. Not narrative, not reflection. A list, 6 items long, of what would happen to Clearwater if she disclosed publicly. Licensing review, donor withdrawal, patient trust collapse, staff attrition, board dissolution. The specific grant, $3.1 million in state funding, tied to a personal certification of executive fitness she had signed 18 months earlier. Below the list, in smaller handwriting pressed harder into the page, James would be okay. He'd land. Patricia too. She was thinking about them. While she was using. While she was running out of options. She was thinking about what they would be left with. The second item in the investigation's final report, the one that received almost no media coverage because it was buried in an appendix, noted that in January 2019, 2 months before her death, Nora had contacted a healthcare attorney in Cincinnati, not Columbus, using a personal email address and a phone number registered to a prepaid phone. The contact was brief. She inquired about the legal exposure of a licensed treatment facility whose executive director voluntarily disclosed a substance use disorder. The attorney had sent a preliminary response outlining the regulatory landscape. There was no follow-up communication. She'd been thinking about coming forward. 2 months before she died, she'd started asking what it would cost, and then the supply changed, and everything accelerated in a direction that made the question of disclosure suddenly terribly irrelevant. By the winter of 2018, the drug supply in Columbus had been quietly transformed by a molecule that most users had no way of detecting and no reliable method of testing for. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid developed in the 1960s for surgical anesthesia, 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine by weight, had begun appearing in the illicit heroin supply not as a separate product, but as an adulterant, mixed in by suppliers at various points in the distribution chain to increase potency and reduce costs. The problem was consistency, or rather, the complete absence of it. One batch might contain trace amounts. The next might be so heavily cut with fentanyl that a dose calibrated for ordinary heroin became, without any warning, a lethal overdose. Ohio's overdose death rate had been climbing for years. Fentanyl was the reason it had stopped climbing and started surging. In 2018, fentanyl was detected in 73% of all overdose deaths in Franklin County. 73%. The coroner's office had begun listing fentanyl as the primary cause of death in cases where it was present alongside heroin, because the fentanyl was almost always what actually killed. Nora knew about fentanyl's presence in the supply. She'd sat in a County Health Coalition meeting in September 2018 and heard the coroner's office present exactly this data. She'd asked 2 questions, sharp, specific questions about detection rates and geographic distribution within the county, and had taken notes on a yellow legal pad. She did not know that her own supply had been compromised. There was no way to know. That was the point. That was the thing that made fentanyl contamination categorically different from every other risk in the illicit drug supply. It was invisible, odorless, present at quantities too small to see, detectable only with a testing strip that cost $1 and that almost nobody in the illicit supply chain used because using one required acknowledging the risk existed. Clearwater had begun distributing fentanyl test strips to clients as part of a harm reduction protocol Nora had personally approved in 2017. The box of strips sat in the supply room, 40 feet from her office. The contact she'd used for 2 years was arrested on February 6, 2019. Nora learned about it not through any official channel, but through the particular silence that follows when a phone number stops working. 3 calls over 2 days, no answer, no voicemail, just a flat electronic nothing that told her everything she needed to know without a single word. She'd been through supply disruptions before. She knew the protocol her own body would begin running within 48 hours. First the restlessness, then the muscle aches beginning in the legs, then the cold sweats arriving in waves, then the full cascade of withdrawal that opioid-dependent bodies produce when the supply stops. Nausea, cramping, an unbearable crawling sensation in the skin, a psychological desperation that is not metaphorical, but neurological, the brain stripped of its artificial floor and falling. She had 11 days' worth of supply remaining when the contact went silent. She counted it twice. The calculation she ran was the same one she'd been running in various forms for 8 years. How to manage the gap, how to close the distance between what she had and what she needed, how to keep the wall between the parking garage and the desk standing for 11 more days while she found another source. She'd done this before. She'd always found a way. February in Columbus runs cold and grey with a specific Midwestern relentlessness. Not dramatic cold, not snowstorm cold, just the kind of persistent bone-level chill that makes every outdoor moment feel slightly hostile. Nora drove on 4 separate evenings to locations she'd used as contact points in previous years, parking lots and side streets and a gas station on the east side she'd visited twice in 2016. Nothing. The network she'd navigated for years had shifted in the way that illicit supply networks shift when enforcement pressure increases, not gone, but relocated, restructured, operating through new channels she didn't have access to. She stretched her supply, half doses then smaller. Her body registered every reduction. By the last week of February, she was sleeping 3 hours a night and arriving at Clearwater with her jaw set in a way that Patricia noticed and filed and said nothing about, because Patricia had been filing things for years, and the filing had never led anywhere, and she did not know what the alternative was. James noticed the jaw too. He noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon when he passed her in the hallway, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not unfamiliar exactly, but compressed, like a person holding something very heavy and trying not to let the effort show in their face. He almost stopped. He kept walking. He thought about that moment for the rest of the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock had convinced himself he was projecting. He was not projecting. In the last days of February 2019, Nora found a new source through a chain of contacts she later described in the final journal entry. The last thing she wrote in the locked car journal, dated February 27th, as third-hand, unknown provenance, no choice. 3 words that contain, if you have the context to read them, an entire risk assessment. She knew that buying from an unknown source in a supply chain contaminated by fentanyl was categorically different from anything she had done before. She knew it the way she knew everything, precisely, clinically, completely. She bought enough to last 2 weeks. The transaction happened in the parking lot of a laundromat on Livingston Avenue on the afternoon of February 28th. She was there for under 3 minutes. She drove directly to Clearwater, went to her office, reviewed a grant document for 90 minutes, attended a 4 o'clock check-in with the clinical director, and drove home at 6:15. The night was ordinary. She ate something. She slept better than she had in 2 weeks. The supply held. She told herself she would use this 2 weeks to find something more reliable. She told herself in the same breath that she was going to look at the attorney's email again, the one from January, the preliminary assessment of disclosure costs. She did not look at it that night. She would look at it tomorrow. She went to work the next morning. March moved forward the way February had. Cold, grey, relentless. The first week passed. Clearwater was in the middle of a state licensing renewal process, a biennial requirement that generated several hundred pages of documentation and required Nora's signature on 37 separate forms. Patricia had organised the paperwork into colour-coded folders, blue for clinical compliance, green for financial, red for personnel. The red folder was the thickest. Nora worked through it methodically, evenings at her desk after the staff had gone, the building quiet, the third floor lit by the lamp at her desk and the ambient glow of the Columbus skyline visible through the window behind her. She was alone in the building most evenings by 8 o'clock. The night security guard, a retired Franklin County Sheriff's deputy named Gerald, who had worked the overnight at Clearwater for 9 years, did a sweep at 9 p.m. and again at midnight and again at 4 a.m. He knew Nora's car. When it was in the lot after 7, he made a point of knocking on her office door during the 9 o'clock sweep, the same gentle double knock every time, and she would call out that she was fine, and he would continue down the hall. 9 o'clock, March 3rd, 2019. Gerald knocked. She called out. He continued. She had stayed that night with the stated intention, communicated to Patricia via a 6 o'clock text message, of finishing the personnel compliance folder. The folder was real. It was on the desk. 3 of the 37 forms were still unsigned when she set the pen down sometime after 10 p.m. and sat back in her chair and looked at the window for a while. She'd used that morning, in the parking garage as always. The dose had felt different, not dramatically but perceptibly, in the way that someone with 8 years of intimacy with a substance notices gradations that would be invisible to anyone else. Slightly faster in its effect, slightly heavier in the first 30 minutes. She had noted it and filed it and walked into the building. She used again that night, in the office. She did not go to the supply room. She kept what she needed in the contact lens case in her bag. Always, every day. The same system that had organised her mornings for years. She kept the lamp on. She kept the personnel folder open on the desk. She was not, by any reconstruction the investigation could make, in a state of extreme impairment when she used. She was managing a dose she had calibrated to maintain the floor, the same calculation she had made thousands of times before. What she did not know, could not have known, had no mechanism to detect, was that the supply from the laundromat parking lot on February 28th was carrying fentanyl at a concentration approximately 8 times higher than the heroin content it was cut into. Not uniformly distributed through the batch, which was itself the specific danger. Some portions of the supply were minimally contaminated, some were catastrophically so, and there was no external indicator, no colour, no texture, no smell, no anything that distinguished one from the other. The dose she had taken that morning had come from the lower concentration portion of the supply. The dose she took that night did not. Fentanyl at high concentration acts on the opioid receptors in the brainstem, specifically on the receptors that regulate breathing, with a speed and completeness that does not allow for the kind of gradual warning that overdose sometimes produces. There is no period of distress that announces itself clearly enough to trigger a response. What happens instead is a narrowing. The breathing slows, the body relaxes in a way that resembles sleep. The consciousness dims without alarm because the opioid receptors are doing exactly what opioids tell them to do, suppressing everything, including the drive to breathe. She would have felt at first nothing alarming. The familiar warmth, the familiar settling, then less. At some point in the hours between the 9 p.m. sweep and the 4 a.m. sweep, she reached for her phone. The screen showed James Okafor's name. The call was initiated at 3:08 a.m. The duration recorded in the phone's outgoing call log was 0 seconds. The call failed before it connected, either because the signal dropped or because her hand could no longer maintain the pressure needed to complete it. The phone remained on the desk beside the yellow legal pad, screen still lit in the dark office, showing his name, showing 3:08, showing nothing else. Gerald knocked at 4 a.m. No answer. He tried the door. It opened. The lamp was still on. The personnel folder was open on the desk. 3 forms unsigned. Nora was in her chair with her reading glasses on, and her hands folded in her lap in a posture that looked, in the first second, like someone who had fallen asleep at her desk. Gerald knew, in the second second, that it was not that. He called 911 at 4:02 a.m. He stood in the doorway and did not go in. He'd been a sheriff's deputy for 26 years. He had seen things. He stood in the doorway of the office of the woman who had built this place and looked at the photograph on the wall. The same photograph as the one in the lobby downstairs, the same composed smile, the same dark hair pulled back. And he waited for the dispatcher to pick up, and the building was completely silent around him. The paramedics arrived at 4:19 a.m., 17 minutes. They worked with the speed and focus of people who understand that every second has a specific clinical weight. They administered naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal medication, the same drug that Clearwater distributed to clients and families as part of its harm reduction program, the same drug whose wider availability Nora had advocated for in 3 separate public health forums. Naloxone works by displacing opioids from the receptors, reversing the overdose, pulling the person back. It works within minutes when administered in time. The fentanyl concentration in her system had already done what fentanyl at that level does. The window had closed before Gerald's 4 a.m. knock. The tox screen confirmed it 4 days later. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as acute fentanyl and heroin toxicity. The manner of death: accident. At 6:14 a.m., the first morning staff member arrived. A counsellor named Deb, who had worked at Clearwater for 6 years, who parked in the same spot every morning, who noticed the ambulance before she noticed anything else. She stood in the parking lot for a moment without moving, her keys in her hand, the cold morning air doing what cold air does, and then she walked to the entrance because she did not know what else to do. The phone on the desk still showed James Okafor's name, 3:08 a.m. He was on the highway when Patricia called him at 6:47, driving to work the same route he had driven for 4 years, past the same Sunoco station and the same elementary school with the marquee sign that changed every 2 weeks. He answered on the second ring. Patricia said 4 words before her voice gave out entirely. He pulled off the highway. He sat in the parking lot of a grocery store on Bethel Road with the engine running and the heat on, and his hands on the steering wheel, and did not move for 45 minutes. Then something shifted. Not resolution, not acceptance. just the absence of any other available action, and he put the car in drive. He went to Clearwater, because he did not know what else to do. What he did not know yet, what no one knew yet, was that the phone had been in her hand at 3:08 in the morning, that she had been trying to reach him, that in the last coherent minutes of her life, when she understood what was happening to her in the way that only someone with her specific knowledge would understand it, the person she had reached for was the one she had pulled out of the worst moment of his own life 11 years earlier. The question of what she would have said, what those words would have been, if the call had connected, if he had answered, was the one that would follow James Okafor for the rest of his life. He did not have the answer. Nobody did. The board of Clearwater Recovery Center held an emergency session on March 5th, 2019, the day after. 12 people in a conference room on the second floor, the same room where Nora had run budget reviews and grant presentations and the occasional difficult personnel conversation. The room still had her handwriting on the whiteboard from a meeting 2 weeks earlier, a column of numbers relating to the licensing renewal, never erased because nobody had needed the board space since. Someone noticed it 20 minutes into the session and got up and erased it without comment. The meeting continued. The board's first decision was to retain an external crisis communications firm. The second was to place the clinical director, Dr. Randall Ferris, in the role of acting executive director pending a formal search. The third decision, the one that took 4 hours of debate and produced the most fractured vote, 7-5, was whether to issue a public statement that named the cause of death. They named it heroin overdose, pending toxicological confirmation. The statement went out at 4 p.m. on March 5th and landed in newsrooms across Ohio within the hour. The coverage was immediate and enormous. Not because addiction deaths were rare in Ohio in 2019. They were tragically common, so common that individual deaths rarely made the news unless they carried a particular story. But because this one carried the specific, almost unbearable irony that journalists and the public both recognized instantly and could not look away from. The founder of the state's largest addiction treatment center, Heroin, her own office, the photograph in the lobby, every major Ohio newspaper ran it above the fold on March 6th. National outlets picked it up by midday. Social media did what social media does. The story moved fast and wide, carrying with it both genuine grief and the particular cruelty of people who encounter irony and cannot resist pointing at it. Patricia Leung did not read any of the coverage. She gave a statement to investigators on March 7th, a 2-hour recorded interview in a conference room at the Franklin County Health Department, conducted by a state licensing investigator and a representative from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. She was precise, chronological, and complete. She described the first incident report, the second, the memo that had closed both without audit. She described the elevator moment. She described the water bottle. She described 18 years of small observations filed and never acted on, each one individually dismissible, collectively damning. At the end of the interview, the investigator asked if she had anything to add. She sat for a moment. Then she said that she wanted the record to reflect one thing, that Nora Ellison had built something real, that the people in those beds were real, that whatever had happened to Nora did not change what Clearwater had done for 4,000 people, and she did not want the institution to become a footnote to the scandal when the scandal was only one part of the story. The investigator noted her comment. It appeared in the final report in a single summarizing sentence. Rosa Tanner, the night shift nurse with a handwritten notebook, was interviewed on March 9th. Her notebook, the one with the hash marks next to dates, 2 years of informal counts, was entered into the investigation's evidence log as Exhibit 14. She had kept it in the pocket of her scrubs for 2 years, saying nothing to nobody except Patricia, waiting for something to happen that never did. She was not disciplined. The investigation found that she had followed appropriate reporting channels and that the failure had occurred above her, not at her level. She resigned from Clearwater in April. She took a position at a different facility across town and did not speak publicly about any of it for 3 years. The investigation ran 7 months, from March through October 2019. The final report was 114 pages. Its central finding was not that Clearwater had failed as an institution in any clinical sense. Patient outcomes data remained strong throughout the period in question. No patients had been harmed by the missing medication. The facility's treatment programs had continued operating at or above state standards. The central finding was structural, that the oversight mechanisms of a licensed treatment facility had a fundamental blind spot built into their architecture. The executive director reviewed the compliance reports. The executive director countersigned the audit logs. The executive director was the last line of accountability and simultaneously the person least subject to external scrutiny. The report used a specific phrase that appeared 3 times in different sections: institutional trust as oversight failure. The idea that the person at the top of a system is often trusted rather than verified, and that the gap between those two things, in a system dealing with controlled substances and vulnerable people, is the exact gap where the worst outcomes live. Danny Ellison learned about his sister's death from a phone call at 7 a.m. on March 4th. He was at his kitchen table in Dayton with a cup of coffee, the morning news on the television with the sound low, when his cell phone showed Nora's home number. Not Nora's cell, her home landline, which she almost never used. He answered it and heard his niece Meg's voice. Meg, who was 24 now, and had been staying with her father in Dayton that weekend, and he knew before she finished the first sentence. Danny Ellison had been sober for 25 years by March 2019. He had worked the same medical supply inventory job for 19 years, remarried in 2008, had a second daughter who was 9 years old and called him Dad, with knees that still, on certain mornings, surprised him. He had not known. He'd spoken to Nora on the phone 11 days before she died. A Sunday evening call, the kind they had every few weeks, nothing remarkable. News about Meg and the licensing renewal and a half-marathon Nora mentioned she was thinking about registering for in the spring. She had sounded fine. She had sounded like Nora. He delivered the eulogy on March 14th at a funeral home in Columbus, in a room with 230 people in it. He spoke for 18 minutes. Several journalists were present, and several newspapers quoted a portion of what he said, though none quoted it fully, because the full version was not the kind of thing that fit into a news story without demanding more space than editors were willing to give. What he said in its fullness was this: he had spent 30 years watching his sister build a life around the wreckage of his own early one. He had believed for all of those years that he understood what drove her, that she had seen what addiction did to someone she loved and had decided to spend her life fighting it. He still believed that. But standing in that room, he said, he understood something he had not understood before, which was that the driving force he had attributed entirely to love and purpose had carried somewhere inside it something else, a knowledge of the pull that was not academic, a familiarity with a feeling of relief that she had described to him once years ago, that he had thought she was describing on his behalf. He said he had thanked her for understanding. He had never asked her how she understood. 25 years sober, and he had missed it. Not because he wasn't paying attention, because she was the one he had always looked to for the answers, and it had not occurred to him to look at her with the same eyes she had taught him to turn on himself. He sat down. The room was very quiet. In May 2019, the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services proposed a new regulation requiring third-party audits of controlled substance logs at all licensed residential treatment facilities, conducted by independent clinical reviewers with no institutional relationship to the facility being audited. The regulation moved through the comment period with unusual speed. The Clearwater case had generated enough public attention that the political will for reform existed in a way it typically did not. The regulation was finalised in January 2020. It applied to every licensed facility in the state. It required quarterly audits, unannounced, with reports submitted directly to the state rather than to facility leadership. The gap that Rosa Tanner's notebook had documented, the gap that Exhibit 14 had made undeniable, was, at least structurally, closed. Advocates in the addiction treatment field began referring to the new protocol informally as the Ellison Protocol, though the state never gave it that name officially. The name spread anyway, in the quiet way that names spread inside professional communities, mentioned at conferences, used in training materials, passed from one facility director to another, in the shorthand that develops around things too complicated to explain from scratch every time. Clearwater itself did not close. The board had debated this, privately in sessions that were not publicly documented, and concluded that closing would serve nobody, least of all the patients currently in residence. Dr. Ferris served as acting director for 11 months. The permanent director hired in February 2020 was a woman from Cincinnati with 15 years of facility management experience and no prior connection to Nora or to Clearwater. She kept all of Nora's clinical programs. She kept the peer support model. She kept James Okafor. James had not spoken publicly about any of it for 4 months after the death. He ran his groups. He attended his master's program classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He sat on the bench at Hoover Reservoir on June 14th, 2019, his 6th sobriety anniversary, and stayed longer than usual, 2 hours instead of 1, watching the water move. In July 2019, he was invited to speak at a conference on addiction in healthcare professionals, held in Cincinnati, organised by the Ohio chapter of the National Council for Mental Well-Being. He almost declined. He accepted 2 days before the deadline, on a Wednesday evening, sitting at the desk in his apartment that he had finally acquired, a real desk, wood, second-hand, from an estate sale in Worthington. He spoke for 22 minutes. He did not use notes. He talked about what it felt like to know someone and not know them, about the specific way trust can function as a blindfold, in the very moment it feels most like clarity. He talked about Nora the way someone talks about a person when the grief is still raw, but the thinking has had enough time to get precise, not sentimentally, not bitterly, but with the particular honesty of someone who has been sitting with a complicated thing long enough to stop flinching at its edges. He said that healthcare and social service professionals develop addiction at roughly twice the rate of the general population, and that the field had almost no functional infrastructure for identifying or treating their own. He said that the stigma inside addiction treatment, the expectation that the people doing the work had to be beyond the reach of the thing they were treating, was producing exactly the outcome stigma always produced: silence, concealment, and preventable death. He cited Nora by name. He cited the Meridian House admission, the Pittsburgh admission, the false name. He had been given access to those records by the investigation, with the family's permission. Danny had consented immediately when asked, had said, without hesitation, that Nora would have wanted people to know. The room was silent in a particular way that rooms are silent when something has been said that cannot be unsaid and that nobody wants to interrupt. Afterwards, 17 people came to speak to him individually. 11 of them were working addiction treatment professionals. 4 of those 11 told him something about themselves that they said they had not told anyone else. He gave each of them his direct number. The question that remained, the one the investigation could not answer, that no report or testimony or journal entry could fully resolve, was not about the system or the oversight or the fentanyl in the supply or the false name in Indiana and Pittsburgh. Those questions had answers, partial and imperfect but real. The question that remained was the one Danny had named without quite naming it in that eulogy. Whether Nora, in the process of building the most effective tool she knew for saving people from the thing she feared most, had built it partly as a container for something she'd been carrying since before Danny's recovery, before Ohio State, before the half-marathons and the grants and the photograph in the lobby. Whether the wall between the parking garage and the desk had always been thinner than it looked, whether she had known that too. The journal answered many things. It did not answer that one. The last entry, dated February 27th, 2019, 5 days before she died, ended mid-observation, the sentence trailing off the way the last lines on the yellow legal pad had trailed off, the letters growing uneven and then stopping, as if she'd been interrupted, as if she meant to come back to it. She had not come back to it. James Okafor pulled into the Clearwater parking lot at 7:51 a.m. on March 4th, 2019. He had sat in the grocery store parking lot on Bethel Road for 45 minutes, with the engine running and his hands on the wheel, and the heat doing nothing useful against the particular cold that had settled inside the car. He had not cried. He had not called anyone back. He had sat with the 4 words Patricia had said before her voice gave out, and he had let them be what they were, and then he had put the car in drive because there was nothing else available to him in that moment except motion. The ambulance was still in the lot when he arrived. One paramedic was outside near the vehicle, writing on a clipboard. The morning shift staff stood in a loose cluster near the entrance, some in coats they had not fully put on, arms half in the sleeves, the way people dress when they receive news before they finished getting ready for it. James parked in his usual spot, the third space from the end of the second row, the one he had parked in every working day for 4 years. He sat for another moment. Then he got out. He walked through the lobby without stopping. He looked at the photograph near the reception desk, the composed smile, the dark hair pulled back, the eyes that looked directly at the camera with the steadiness of someone who had decided, a long time ago, exactly how she wanted to be seen. He had walked past that photograph hundreds of times. He had never looked at it the way he looked at it that morning. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The door to her office was closed. Yellow incident tape across the frame, not police tape, just the facility's own internal protocol for rooms under investigation, a procedure Nora had written into the operations manual herself in 2003. James stood in the hallway outside the door for a moment. The hallway was empty. The building had the specific quality of silence that institutions take on when the person who defined their atmosphere is suddenly absent. Not quiet exactly, but hollowed, as if the air pressure had changed. He turned and went back downstairs. He spent the rest of that day doing what he did every day, because the clients in the residential wing still woke up that morning with the same needs they had woken up with every other morning, and the peer support group still met at 10 a.m., and the chair at the front of the room still needed someone in it. He ran the group. He was present in the way he had learned to be present, not performing okayness, but not collapsing into his own grief in a room full of people who had their own. Afterward, 3 clients came to him individually with things they needed. He handled each one. Patricia found him at 2 o'clock in the break room, both of them standing at the counter, neither of them making coffee, just standing near the machine because the break room was the only room without a clear function that day, and therefore the only room that felt possible. She told him about the phone. She had heard it from the lead investigator who had mentioned it while documenting the items on Nora's desk. The outgoing call log, 3:08 a.m., James Okafor, 0 seconds. She told him this quietly and directly, because Patricia Leung had spent 18 years in a profession that required delivering hard information clearly, and she had learned it from Nora, and she was not going to deliver it any other way. James set both hands flat on the counter. He stood like that for a long time. He had been home at 3:08 a.m. asleep, his phone on the nightstand charging, volume on. He always kept the volume on, a habit from his years as a program coordinator when a client crisis could come at any hour. The call would have woken him. He would have answered it. He knew this with a completeness that had no productive destination. He had not been awake. She must have known that. She had reached for him anyway. The photograph stayed in the lobby for 3 years. Nobody formally proposed removing it in the first year. It felt too soon, and then too weighted with implication, as if removing it would constitute a verdict that the institution wasn't ready to deliver. In the second year, the new director raised it at a board meeting as an agenda item, framed carefully as a question of what the facility wanted its public spaces to represent. The board discussed it for 40 minutes. The vote was 8-4 to leave it where it was. The 4 who voted to remove it were all people who had joined the board after Nora's death and had no direct experience of her living presence in the building. The 8 who voted to leave it had all been in that lobby on a morning when she had walked past them, and they had felt, without being able to articulate exactly why, that the work they were doing mattered. James voted to leave it. He did not explain his vote, and nobody asked him to. By 2022, he had completed his master's degree, been licensed as an independent social worker in Ohio, and built the peer support program at Clearwater into something that had become a training model. 3 other facilities in the state had adopted its structure. 2 more were in the process of doing so. He had also, in the 3 years since the Cincinnati conference, spoken at 19 addiction medicine events, always about the same thing. The specific vulnerability of helping professionals, the silence that institutional trust produces, the distance between knowing a thing and being able to apply it to yourself. He had become, without planning to become it, the person who carried this story forward professionally. Not because he had decided to, because the story had made him the person it needed, and there had been nothing to do but show up as that person. He still drove past the Sunoco station and the elementary school every morning on his way to work. The marquee at the school changed every 2 weeks. Announcements, events, the occasional quote from someone whose name the school committee had voted on. He read it every time he passed, the way you read familiar things without thinking about it. On a Tuesday in November 2022, the marquee read, "It always seems impossible until it's done." He'd read it at 35 miles per hour and been a quarter mile past it before his brain finished processing the words. He did not know who had chosen that one. He thought about it for the rest of the drive. Now return to a morning in March 2019, before the ambulance, before the phone calls, before the lobby and the photograph and everything that came after. Return to the 3rd floor of Clearwater Recovery Center, to the office at the end of the hall, to the lamp still on, and the window showing the Columbus skyline against a sky that had not yet decided whether it would stay dark or begin to change. The personnel folder was open on the desk, 3 forms unsigned. The yellow legal pad beside it, the last 2 lines trailing off mid-sentence, the handwriting unravelling at its edges the way handwriting does when the hand that makes it is losing its argument with gravity. The phone on the desk showed one thing, a name, a time, a call that had not connected. She had reached for the one person she had helped climb out of the dark in the last minutes that she had the capacity to reach for anything. Not the board, not Patricia, not Danny, who was her blood and her history and the original reason she had built all of this. James, the one who had sat in her intake session in 2013 wearing a marine field jacket and filled out his paperwork with a mechanical pencil he had brought himself. The one she had watched become something from nothing, or rather, from the specific nothing that comes just before a person finds out who they actually are. Maybe she wanted to tell him the truth. The full truth. Not the 8-month lie, but the real shape of it. All 8 years, both treatment attempts, the false name, the contact lens case in her bag, the parking garage, the wall she had built and maintained, and finally, in that office on the night of March 3rd, run out of the strength to hold up. Maybe she'd decided in those final minutes when the fentanyl was doing what fentanyl does, and she understood with her full clinical knowledge exactly what was happening to her, that he deserved to know who had actually believed in him. Or maybe she just needed to hear a voice she trusted. There is no way to know. The call lasted 0 seconds, and that 0 is permanent, sealed, beyond the reach of any investigation or journal or conference speech or vote about a photograph. What is not beyond reach, the Ellison Protocol, running quietly in the background of every licensed treatment facility in Ohio, auditors arriving unannounced with clipboards and no institutional loyalties, counting tablets, checking logs, looking for the gap between what the records say and what the cabinet holds. What is not beyond reach. 11 of 17 addiction professionals who approached James after a conference in Cincinnati, 4 of whom told him something they had not told anyone else, all 4 of whom, he confirmed this in a 2022 interview without names, were still in their positions and still sober 3 years later. What is not beyond reach? A peer support program that carries, in its structure and its underlying philosophy, the fingerprints of a woman who understood that recovery required not just clinical precision, but the specific gravity of someone who had been there and come back, who sat across from you not as an authority but as evidence that the distance was crossable. She built that program. She built the room where James Okafor learned to be the person who runs it. The lamp was still on when Gerald found her. The Columbus skyline was still visible through the window behind her chair. The Person folder was still open. The phone still showed the name. James Okafor knows all of this because the investigation told him, and because Patricia told him, and because he has spent 6 years now building a life in the space that knowledge occupies, carrying it the way you carry something that is both too heavy and too important to set down. He has decided that not knowing what she would have said is something he can live with. Some mornings he believes that. The phone on her desk showed 3:08 a.m. She'd known he would not be awake. She had reached for him anyway, across the dark, across the distance, across 8 years of a secret she'd carried alone through every room of the place she had built to hold other people's pain. She called him at 3:08 in the morning and the call didn't connect and the lamp stayed on until Gerald arrived, and the photograph in the lobby stayed on the wall for 3 years, and the marquee at the elementary school keeps changing every 2 weeks, and James Okafor still parks in the 3rd space from the end of the 2nd row every single morning when he comes to work. In the place she built, still doing what she taught him,